Okay, so picture this. It's 1975, Saigon is falling, the U.S. is scrambling to evacuate, and images of helicopters lifting off rooftops are seared into our memories.
Yeah.
Now imagine a similar crisis, but instead of a single city, an entire empire is collapsing. That's the world we're diving into today, the world of Austria-Hungary in the wake of Archduke Franz Ferdinand's assassination.
It's a great analogy.
Yeah.
The assassination wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was a political earthquake that shook an already unstable empire to its core.
Exactly. And you've been digging deep into the sources trying to understand how Austria reacted in those crucial first few days.
Right.
What did you uncover?
Well, the popular narrative is that Austria was indifferent to Franz Ferdinand's death, but that's simply not true.
Okay.
The initial reaction was a mix of shock, outrage, and profound grief. Newspapers across the empire were filled with stories about the orphan children, the brutality of the assassination, and the looming threat to the nation's security.
So there was a very real sense of national mourning, almost like a collective trauma.
Precisely. And that trauma was amplified by the fact that the assassins were Serbian nationalists with ties to groups that Austria saw as a direct threat to their empire.
Okay, so right away the fingers pointed at Serbia.
Um,
But was there any concrete evidence linking the Serbian government to the assassination?
There's no doubt that the assassins were trained and armed by groups deeply embedded within the Serbian military and intelligence networks. They even received help crossing the border from Serbian officials. Whether the Serbian government directly ordered the assassination is still debated by historians, but there's no denying their role in creating the environment that made it possible.
That certainly adds another layer to the story.
Hmm.
So Austria is reeling from this attack. They believe Serbia is involved.
Right.
What happens next?
Well, instead of offering condolences or cooperating with the investigation, Serbia's response further inflamed the situation. There were widespread celebrations in Belgrade following the assassination.
Wow, that seems incredibly provocative, almost deliberately antagonistic.
It was. And to make matters worse, Prime Minister Pasich gave a series of defiant speeches, essentially warning Austria against any retaliation.
So not exactly the actions of a nation trying to de-escalate the situation.
Not at all.
Hmm.
From Austria's perspective, it confirmed their worst fears. Serbia was a dangerous, expansionist power determined to undermine their empire.
This is where it gets really interesting. You mentioned Serbia's expansionist ambitions.
Yes.
Can you elaborate on that? Why was Austria so concerned about Serbia?
Austria-Hungary was a sprawling, multi-ethnic empire already struggling with internal tensions.
Yep.
They ruled over a diverse population of Czechs, Slovaks, Poles, Ukrainians, Romanians, Italians, Serbs, and Croats, all vying for greater autonomy. Serbia, with its growing military strength and its vision of a unified South Slav state, represented a direct challenge to the very fabric of the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
So they saw Serbia as a threat not just to their territory, but to their very existence as a multi-ethnic empire.
Exactly, they were terrified of a domino effect.
Well-
If Serbia succeeded in breaking away and forming a larger South Slav state, it could trigger a wave of separatist movements within their own borders.
And within Austria, were there already voices calling for a hard line against Serbia even before the assassination?
Absolutely. The most prominent among them was General Konrad von Hötzendorf, the chief of the Austro-Hungarian General Staff. He had been advocating for a preemptive strike against Serbia for years. He saw them as a poisonous snake that needed to be crushed before it could strike.
Conrad sounds like he was itching for a fight. It's ironic, isn't it?
Mm.
The very act that was supposed to weaken Serbia ended up giving the hawks in Austria the excuse they needed to push for war.
It is, and it's worth noting that Franz Ferdinand himself was actually a voice for peace and opposed to war with Serbia. He believed that war would be disastrous for the empire.
Wow, that's a fascinating twist. It makes Austria's response even more complicated.
It does. While the military hawks saw the assassination as a justification for war, there were other influential figures within Austria-Hungary who were much more hesitant.
So Austria's leadership wasn't entirely united on how to respond.
Not at all. The Hungarian Prime Minister, István Tisza, was a key figure who expressed strong reservations. He feared that incorporating more Slavs into the empire, which would likely be a consequence of attacking Serbia, would dilute Hungarian influence and weaken their position within the dual monarchy.
Ah, so internal politics added another layer of complexity to the situation.
Yes.
Austria was like a house divided against itself.
A very apt description.
Yeah.
This internal disagreement highlights the challenges of decision-making within the Austro-Hungarian Empire. They were facing pressure from their own military grappling with internal political divisions and trying to figure out how to respond to Serbia's perceived provocation.
And all of this is happening in the immediate aftermath of a high-profile assassination, with the eyes of the world watching. Talk about a pressure cooker.
It was a critical moment. Austria felt they needed to act decisively, but they also knew that any military action against Serbia would likely have major repercussions across Europe, especially given the intricate web of alliances that existed at the time.
And that brings us to the big question, what about the rest of Europe? How did Austria's allies and potential enemies factor into their decision-making?
That's the crux of it. Austria was convinced they needed the backing of their most powerful ally before they could make any moves against Serbia. They pinned their hopes on Germany, but their confidence in German support was, as we'll see, based on a dangerous miscalculation.
This is where the stakes really start to rise. We've got Austria on the brink of a potentially world-altering decision, and their plea for German support is going to have massive consequences.
Exactly. What's fascinating here is that Austria, based on past experiences where Russia backed down during previous crises, was overly confident that they could strong-arm Serbia without triggering a wider conflict.
Okay.
They believed Russia, Serbia's protector, would yield again.
It sounds like they were dangerously underestimating the potential for things to spiral out of control.
They were. But to understand why, we need to delve into the complex dynamics between Austria, Germany, and the rest of Europe. And that's where we'll pick up in our next deep dive. Austria was pitting their hopes on Germany, but their confidence in their ally was, as we'll see, based on a dangerous miscalculation. To understand why, we need to delve into Germany's own complex dynamics and its place in the European balance of power.
Okay, so let's shift our focus to Germany. You mentioned earlier that Germany wasn't a monolithic entity.
Right.
It had a powerful military, but also a burgeoning industrial sector and a strong socialist movement. How did these competing forces shape Germany's foreign policy?
Germany was a newly unified nation still finding its footing on the world stage. It had rapidly industrialized and militarized, surpassing France as the dominant power in continental Europe.
And that must have made the other European powers pretty nervous, especially Great Britain,
Yes.
which had always been wary of any single power dominating the continent.
Exactly. Germany's rise was viewed with suspicion, particularly by Great Britain, which saw its own naval dominance challenged by Germany's growing fleet.
Right.
This created a lot of tension and fueled a naval arms race between the two countries.
So Germany had a lot to gain, but also a lot to lose. Where did Kaiser Wilhelm II fit into all of this? He had a reputation for being a bit unpredictable.
Wilhelm II was a complex and often contradictory figure. He was obsessed with military pomp and circumstance, but he also understood the delicate balance of power in Europe and was wary of starting a major war.
It's interesting that you mentioned his wariness, because he was also known for his bombastic speeches and his aggressive rhetoric. How do you reconcile those two sides of his personality?
It's important to remember that Wilhelm II, despite his bluster, had never actually initiated a war. He had often cautioned Austria against taking provocative actions, and he understood that a major war would be a gamble with potentially catastrophic consequences.
So Austria might have been a bit too optimistic in assuming Germany would automatically back them up in a war with Serbia?
That's putting it mildly. The Austrians, desperate for German support, send a young diplomat, Count Alexander Hoyos, to Berlin with two crucial documents: a general memorandum outlining their case against Serbia, and a personal letter from Emperor Franz Joseph to Kaiser Wilhelm II.
The fate of Europe hinging on a couple of pieces of paper. Talk about dramatic. What was Germany's response?
The Austrians were hoping for what was essentially a blank check unconditional support for whatever action they chose to take against Serbia.
And did they get it?
Well, not exactly. It's more complicated than that. The Kaiser, along with his Chancellor Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg, was initially supportive of Austria's desire to punish Serbia. They saw the assassination as a dangerous challenge to Austria's prestige and a threat to the stability of the region.
So they were sympathetic to Austria's plight, but were they ready to go to war over it?
That's where things get tricky. Wilhelm II and Bethmann-Hollweg were both hesitant to give Austria a completely free hand. They understood that any Austrian military action against Serbia could easily drag Russia, Serbia's protector, into the conflict.
And that's the nightmare scenario. A localized conflict in the Balkans exploding into a European-wide war.
Precisely. Germany's military leaders, while confident in their own strength, were wary of fighting a two-front war against Russia in the east and France in the west. That had always been their strategic nightmare.
So Germany was walking a tightrope. They wanted to support Austria, but also avoid a wider war.
Yes.
What did they actually tell the Austrians?
The message from Berlin was deliberately vague. They encouraged Austria to act swiftly and decisively against Serbia, but they stopped short of giving an explicit guarantee of military support.
So not exactly the blank check Austria was hoping for.
No, Germany was essentially hedging its bets, hoping that a strong Austrian response would intimidate Serbia into backing down without triggering Russian intervention.
But wasn't that a huge gamble? What if Russia didn't back down? After all, Russia had a reputation for being fiercely protective of its Slavic brethren in the Balkans.
It was a colossal gamble, one that ultimately backfired spectacularly. Germany's ambiguous support emboldened Austria, who misinterpreted it as a green light to pursue a hardline policy against Serbia. What's fascinating is that Austria's confidence was partly based on a misreading of history. They looked back at previous crises in the Balkans where Russia had ultimately backed down and assumed that this time would be no different.
But the situation in 1914 was different, wasn't it? Russia was more assertive, more determined to stand up to Austria and Germany.
Yes, the dynamics had shifted. Russia was recovering from its defeat in the Russo-Japanese War and had been modernizing its military. They were also feeling increasingly threatened by Austria-Hungary's expansionist policies in the Balkans. Austria failed to grasp the significance of these changes.
It's starting to feel like a series of tragic miscalculations one after another.
That's a good way to put it. Austria miscalculated Germany's willingness to provide unconditional support, and they misjudged Russia's resolve. And those miscalculations, combined with the volatile political climate in Europe, created a perfect storm that would soon engulf the entire continent in war.
This is a perfect point to pause our deep dive. We've seen how Austria, reeling from the assassination, turned to Germany for support. But Germany, hesitant to be drawn into a wider war, gave a response that was open to misinterpretation. And Austria, emboldened by what they perceived as German backing, was about to take a fateful step that would make war almost inevitable. So we left off with Austria, feeling like they had Germany's backing, preparing to issue an ultimatum to Serbia. What did this ultimatum entail, and what was Austria's strategy?
The ultimatum, delivered to Serbia on July 23, 1914, was a meticulously crafted document. It was designed to be virtually impossible for Serbia to accept without appearing to compromise its sovereignty and independence.
So it wasn't really about finding a peaceful resolution.
No, not at all. It was more about forcing Serbia into a corner, creating a justification for war. The Austrians were convinced that Serbia would reject the ultimatum outright, or agree to it only partially, giving Austria the pretext they needed to launch a military attack. They were setting a trap, essentially.
What were some of the key demands in this ultimatum?
Well, the ultimatum was deliberately harsh and contained 10 very specific and stringent demands. Some of the key ones included suppressing any publications or organizations hostile to Austria-Hungary, dismissing Serbian officials involved in anti-Austrian propaganda, and most controversially, allowing Austrian officials to participate in the investigation of the assassination on Serbian soil.
Those are some pretty tough demands.
Yeah.
It sounds like Austria was intentionally trying to provoke Serbia.
Right.
How did Serbia respond?
Serbia was in a very difficult position. They knew that outright rejection of the ultimatum would likely mean war with Austria-Hungary, a war they were ill-prepared to fight. On the other hand, accepting all of the demands would be seen as a humiliating surrender to Austrian dominance. So they tried to find a middle ground.
So they tried to appease Austria without completely capitulating.
Exactly. They agreed to most of the demands, but they balked at the ones that would have allowed Austrian officials to operate freely within Serbia. They argued that this would be a violation of their sovereignty as an independent nation.
It seems like a reasonable compromise given the circumstances.
It does, and many historians believe that Serbia's response was a genuine attempt to avert war. But Austria was determined to have their war, and they were looking for any excuse to reject Serbia's response.
So they weren't really interested in a negotiated settlement.
Yeah.
They'd already made up their minds.
That seems to be the case. Austria promptly declared Serbia's response to be unsatisfactory and broke off diplomatic relations. On July 28, 1914, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia.
It sounds like a slow-motion train wreck, with everyone watching it unfold but powerless to stop it.
That's a very apt analogy. The assassination of Franz Ferdinand had set in motion a chain reaction that was rapidly spiraling out of control. And while there were some efforts at mediation, particularly by Russia and Great Britain, they were ultimately too little, too late.
So Austria declares war on Serbia, and then what?
Well, almost immediately after Austria's declaration of war, Russia, honoring its alliance with Serbia, began mobilizing its troops. They saw Austria's attack on Serbia as a direct threat to their own interests in the Balkans.
And that triggered Germany's entry into the war.
Yes, Germany, bound by its treaty obligations to Austria-Hungary, saw Russia's mobilization as an act of aggression and responded by declaring war on Russia on August 1st, 1914. 2 days later, they declared war on France, Russia's ally.
And just like that, a localized conflict in the Balkans had escalated into a full-blown European war. It's terrifying how quickly things unraveled.
It is a stark illustration of how fragile peace can be, and how quickly seemingly isolated events can spiral out of control. Within just a few weeks, Europe was engulfed in a war that would claim millions of lives and reshape the political landscape of the world.
It's a lot to process. We've gone from a seemingly isolated assassination to the brink of a global war in just a few short weeks.
Yeah.
What does this all mean? What's the takeaway for us looking back at these events from over a century later?
I think one of the key takeaways is the danger of miscalculation in international relations. Austria-Hungary miscalculated Germany's willingness to provide unconditional support, and they misjudged Russia's resolve to defend Serbia. They were operating on assumptions based on past events, failing to grasp how the dynamics of power in Europe had shifted.
It also highlights the importance of clear communication and diplomacy, especially in times of crisis. Misunderstandings and misinterpretations played a significant role in the escalation of this conflict.
Absolutely. Germany's vague assurances to Austria, while intended to avoid a wider war, were interpreted by Austria as a green light to pursue their aggressive policies. And the lack of effective communication channels between the major powers contributed to the rapid escalation of the crisis.
It also serves as a reminder of how seemingly small events can have unforeseen and catastrophic consequences. The assassination of one man in Sarajevo triggered a chain reaction that ultimately led to the deaths of millions and reshaped the course of the 20th century.
Indeed. It's a reminder of the interconnectedness of the world and how events in one corner of the globe can have ripple effects that are felt far and wide.
It's so easy to look back on these events and see all the warning signs, all the missed opportunities to avert disaster. And it makes you wonder, what if things had gone differently? What if Austria had been more cautious? What if Germany had been more clear in its intentions? What if Russia had chosen a different path?
Those are questions that historians continue to debate to this day. And while we can't change the past, we can certainly learn from it. By understanding the complex web of events and decisions that led to World War I, we can hopefully gain a deeper appreciation for the fragility of peace and the importance of diplomacy in preventing future conflicts.
It's a sobering thought, but an important one. And on that note, we come to the end of our deep dive into the July crisis and the outbreak of World War I. We've covered a lot of ground today, but there's always more to learn and explore. So I encourage you to continue your own research and keep questioning the narratives that shape our understanding of history. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.